Call the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure to order. Pursuant to Committee Rule 5F, House Rule 11-2H4, the Chair may postpone further proceedings today on a question of approving any measure or matter adopting an amendment on which a recorded vote or the ayes and nays are ordered. And without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time. Hearing none. Today, the committee will consider H.R. 1108, Aviation Funding Stability Act 2019, H.R. 1775, establishing a task force on notices to airmen, NOTAM improvements, H.R. 367, Pay Our Coast Guard Parity Act of 2019, H.R. 1322, requiring a report on the effects of climate change on the Coast Guard, H.R. 1306, Federal Disaster Assistance Coordination Act, H.R. 1307, Post-Disaster Assistance Online Accountability Act, H.R. 1311, amending the Robert T. Stafford Disaster Relief Emergency Assistance Act to ensure that unmet needs after a major disaster are met, and H.R. 1331, Local Water Protection Act, when competing hearings and obligations for given competing hearings and obligations for members this morning, my hope is to move these measures quickly. The first item for consideration is H.R. 1108, the Aviation Funding Stability Act. I now call up H.R. 1108, ask unanimous consent to discharge the Subcommittee on Aviation from further consideration of H.R. 1108, that it be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. Without objection, so ordered. I also, at this point, would ask unanimous consent to insert support letters for the underlying bill, H.R. 1108, signed by more than 40 organizations representing the aviation industry and labor. Without objection, so ordered. At this point, I'll give some brief opening remarks. In February, the Subcommittee on Aviation hosted a hearing on how the recent shutdown of the federal government affected the operations and workforce of the Federal Aviation Administration, as well as the U.S. aviation system at large. In response, I, along with Aviation Subcommittee Larson, introduced 1108, the Aviation Funding Stability Act of 2019, to ensure all FAA programs function uninterrupted and that all FAA employees remain at work and paid during a future lapse on appropriations. This bill has strong bipartisan support with more than 120 co-sponsors. Under this legislation, a lapse in appropriations would authorize the agency to draw from the Airport and Airway Trust Fund with no general fund contributions to continue all operations, programs, and activities at current funding levels. Obviously, we were all, pleased that the air traffic controllers and a number of pass workers and others continued their work without pay during the longest government shutdown in history. Although ultimately some would attribute the illness, which may have been triggered by excessive stress of a number of air traffic controllers at the en route center, to bringing the shutdown to an end when East Coast traffic was impaired. But obviously, many other employees were impacted in detrimental ways. And in my own district, I was meeting with the tower folks, and there was one new, younger, underpaid, because we don't get any location pay in Eugene, employee who was working overtime because they're understaffed and had taken a job to feed his family driving an Uber after work. So clearly, these employees had to go to some extraordinary lengths just to meet their daily living needs. And it just shouldn't be that way when we have a trust fund that could be drawn on. We do not need to potentially endanger the traveling public. Also, we don't need to delay critical work at the FAA in terms of implementing legislation that we passed last fall on the long-term FAA authorization and inspectors and others. So, this, I think that this bill, and wow, we've got a lot here. I'm not going to read all this. I'll put it in the record. There's a lot to say about our air traffic control and the system here in the United States, the largest, most complex airspace in the world, the safest airspace in the world, and we should do everything we can to, boy, oh boy. Yeah, wow, the staff went wild here. So anyway, I have a very long statement that I will enter into the record. With that, I'd recognize the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The shutdown this winter impacted the FAA and the aviation community overall, and H.R. 1108 is going to help alleviate these impacts by keeping the FAA funded at existing levels during any future lapse in appropriation. And I do believe that the role of Congress is to fulfill its constitutional obligations and to pass appropriations bills. But we must work to ensure that the national airspace system is always running as efficiently as possible to all users. So with that, I'd urge my colleagues to support H.R. 1108 and yield back.
Well, we're moving at pace here. I would recognize Representative Larson to explain the bill, but he's not here. Is there anybody who doesn't understand the bill and wants me to explain it? Okay, excellent. All right, let's move on. At that point, do any other members wish to be recognized for statements on H.R. 1108? Seeing none, I will now consider the bill for amendment, and I believe that we do have an amendment to the bill. I would recognize the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do have an amendment at the desk. I'd ask unanimous consent the amendment be considered as read.
Without objection, so ordered. Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 001 to H.R. 1108, offered by Mr. Graves of Missouri.
Mr. Graves is recognized for 5 minutes.
So I have two letters, one here from the American Association of Airport Executives and one from the Airports Council International in North America, and one from a variety of general aviation groups, including the Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association, the National Business Aviation Association, and the National Air Transport Association. They're all in support of this amendment, and I'd ask unanimous consent that those letters be entered into the record.
Without objection.
As I said at the hearing yesterday, all of the infrastructure funding options, I think, should be on the table, and this amendment would increase funding for the Airport Improvement Program, or AIP, as one of those options. Currently, the unobligated balance in the Aviation Trust Fund is projected to be about $7 billion, which will support the increased investment levels in the amendment. AIP is an important funding source for both large and small airports. Large hubs rely on AIP to finance expensive runway and taxiway projects, while smaller airports rely on it to make even some of the smallest or even the most modest infrastructure improvements. This amendment is going to touch every one of our constituent airports. For example, it's going to increase general aviation airport funding by $130 million, increase noise abatement funding by $170 million, and increase capacity project funding by $225 million. Our discussions on infrastructure funding are going to continue in the weeks and months ahead, but I believe this is an important first step to improve our nation's infrastructure. With that, I'd urge my colleagues to support the amendment. Yield back.
And thank you, gentlemen. I now recognize myself and then subsequently other members who wish to speak to the amendment. I fully support the amendment offered by the ranking member. The AIP levels in last year's bill would be increased by $650 million each year, from $3.35 billion to $4 billion annually through fiscal year 2023. There are sufficient resources in the trust fund to support these investments, so we would not be incurring any new debt or deficit for the annual budget. The FAA has identified a need of $35.1 billion, or $7 billion per year, in AIP grants over the next 5 years. And as we discussed yesterday, that our airports are facing not only unmet needs on that air side, but also other needs that relate to the traveling public with their terminals and gates, et cetera. So we spent quite some time on PFCs yesterday. I thought we had a good discussion. A good case was made by at least one of the airports who testified that when they can build facilities independent of the airlines, that they can bring in new entrants, lower fares for Americans, and have more variety of flights, which is, I think, to be desired. So with that, I fully support this amendment. Are there other members who wish to be recognized? Okay, seeing none. Then are there any amendments to the amendment? Okay, seeing and hearing none. Then if not, the question is on the amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, nay. Hearing none, the amendment is passed. Are there other amendments to the bill? Okay, hearing none. If there are none, the question is now on the adoption favorably reporting H.R. 1108 as amended to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, saying nay. Hearing none, the ayes have it. The bill as amended is approved, ordered, reported favorably to the House. We would now move on to H.R. 1775, establishing a task force on NOTAM improvements, which is an acronym which means notices of something to airmen. I don't know what the T is. I now call up H.R. 1775, asking unanimous consent to discharge Subcommittee on Aviation from further consideration of H.R. 1775 and that be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. Without objection, so ordered. This legislation was introduced by the gentleman, and recognize myself. This was introduced by a gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Stauber. H.R. 1775 will create an important task force to review existing methods for presenting notices to airmen, or NOTAMs, to pilots. NOTAMs provide pilots with essential real-time information regarding abnormalities or issues in the national airspace. While pilots are required to review all NOTAMs before flight, there has been concern about the lengthiness and completeness of critical information contained in NOTAMs and how the information is displayed and organized for pilots. Under H.R. 1775, the task force will determine best practices for organizing, presenting flight operations information to pilots in the air, the most optimal manner, and making recommendations to improve the presentation of NOTAM information. I expect the task force established under H.R. 1775 will lead to good work, recommendations that will improve aviation safety. I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting the bill. What's, okay, all right. I was going to do that, but okay. I would now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Graves, for a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman DeFazio. And I want to thank Mr. Stauber and Mr. Desaulnier for introducing this very important bill. H.R. 1775 improves aviation safety by requiring the FAA to establish a task force to review and make recommendations to improve the presentation of NOTAMs, notices to airmen. On July 7, 2017, there was an Air Canada flight that was approaching San Francisco International Airport that nearly landed on a crowded taxiway with 4 other airplanes waiting there to take off. The crew mistook the taxiway for a cleared runway because the parallel runway was closed at the time. So the NTSB investigation later found that the information about the closed runway was buried on page 8 of a 27-page list of San Francisco NOTAMs. Information on NOTAMs, especially those that are critical to safely operating in and around busy airports, it needs to be better prioritized, and this bill is obviously going to improve that. As a professional pilot, I know how important NOTAMs are. This has been a problem for a while, and it's critical that we have a better prioritization system and make it easier at least to wade through the myriad of NOTAMs that sometimes you get at some airports. This is why I support H.R. 1775 and urge a yes vote today, and I yield back the balance.
Thank you, gentlemen. I would now recognize the subcommittee chair, Mr. Larson from Washington State. Okay, he doesn't want to speak. How about the ranking member of the subcommittee, the other Graves?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just very quickly, as Ranking Member Graves, my father, noted, this is a result of an NTSB recommendation related to a July 2017 near miss by a Canadian Air Canada flight at San Francisco International Airport, where the plane nearly came in and landed on top of several planes loaded with passengers at San Francisco International. It was determined as a result of the NTSB investigation that that the NOTAM was not properly reviewed by the pilots, which resulted in the error. So this, again, recommendation of NTSB to create a task force to look at how we can better ensure the communication of the NOTAMs to pilots and avoid disasters in the future. A bipartisan bill, and I urge adoption.
I thank the gentleman. Are any other member wish to be recognized to speak? Yes.
Thank you, Chair DeFazio and Ranking Member Graves. Pete Stauber, Minnesota 8. I appreciate the consideration of this important legislation that I worked on with my colleague, Congressman DeSagne from California. Notice to airmen or NOTAMs are extremely important to safety in our skies. NOTAMs are critical as they relay safety information to pilots that allow them to understand the possible hazards and conditions of airports and runways before actually getting to the destination airport. The current system simply is not working as well as it should. For example, there is often important safety information buried in reports that could be several inches thick, 25, 30 pages. And this bill creates a task force at the FAA with important input from safety experts and industry professionals to address what changes need to be made to NOTAMs to make air travel even safer than it is. I urge my colleagues to support this bipartisan bill. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for his comments and his work on this legislation. Any other members wish to be recognized? Seeing none? Whoop. Oh, I didn't thought you were just.
I'll be brief, I promise.
Okay, all right.
I
Gentleman
just-
from
I-
California.
I just want to reiterate, it's been a pleasure working with you, and the importance of this, having worked extensively on the near miss at SFO with FAA and with NTSB. I think the crucial quote in all of this was from the chair of NTSB, where he said, "These are garbage and they need to be fixed." So I would say that's a succinct way of saying I hope you all support it.
I thank the gentleman for his colorful remarks, which are very much to the point of how we want to simplify. Let's get the important information up the top. It's just kind of like when Boeing didn't put in the manual that there was a new automated system on the plane. We really want to let people know what's going on. So with that, any amendments? No amendments? Okay, if there are none, questions on the adoption and favorably reporting H.R. 1775 to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, say nay. Nay. Okay, the ayes have it. Bill's approved and reported favorably to the House. All right, we move on now to H.R. 367, the Pay Our Coast Guard Parity Act of 2019. This legislation I would now call H.R. 367 to the committee, asking unanimous consent to discharge Subcommittee Coast Guard Maritime Transportation from further consideration of H.R. 367 that be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. Without objection, so ordered. I do have an amendment in the nature of substitute. Clerk, report the amendment.
Amendment in nature of substitute to H.R. 367, offered by Mr. DeFazio, number 01.
Without objection, the amendment in the nature of substitute shall be considered as read. Without objection, the amendment in the nature of substitute shall be considered as base text for purposes of the amendment. I will now recognize myself on H.R. 367. The Coast Guard's one of our 5 armed uniformed services. It was ironic during the shutdown. I was talking to, I think it was my regional commandant, and he was talking about how the Coasties were working to escort the subs at Bangor. The mariners, the naval folks in the subs were getting paid, and the Coast Guard providing critical security were not being paid. And I mean, this sort of equity is not proper. There was notably a Coast Guard support group put out guidance for Coasties during this very long shutdown. It was particularly hard on junior officers and enlisted ranks, particularly those newest to the service. And the guidance was you could become a dog walker, you could hold a garage sale, blah, 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 et cetera. That is insulting to a critical uniformed service, in the defense of our country, Homeland Security, and also doing double duty with law enforcement and border issues. So, I believe that the Coast Guard should get their pay if the members of the armed forces are getting their pay. The amendment in the nature of a substitute provides permanent authority to appropriate funds to pay members of the Coast Guard. I urge my colleagues on both sides to support the bill. I would now recognize, now will follow my script, and recognize the subcommittee chair, Maloney, to explain the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your leadership on this issue. You have been articulate and passionate about this, and it is much appreciated. As you mentioned, during the recent government shutdown, for the first time in our nation's history, members of an armed force were not paid due to a lapse in appropriations. The men and women of the Coast Guard and their families continued to serve honorably without pay. It was unacceptable and something we must not allow to occur again. H.R. 367, the Pay Our Coast Guard Parity Act, will ensure that members of the Coast Guard and their families do not suffer a similar fate in the future. It's a bipartisan bill, which I was proud to co-author with our chairman, and it would provide pay and benefits for active duty and reserve Coast Guard members, as well as pay and allowances for civilian employees and contractors of the Coast Guard. The bill also provides for the payment of death gratuities, funeral travel, and a housing allowance for dependents of Coast Guard members dying on active duty. And indeed, we lost a member of the Coast Guard recently who was from my district in Mahopac, New York. These are real issues that our Coast Guard families face. The bill also provides retired pay for 50,000 retired Coast Guard members, fulfilling the contract they made with the nation by a career of service. The authority provided by this bill is only triggered when members of the Coast Guard are the only members of the armed forces not receiving pay. The authority terminates when a continuing resolution or appropriation is enacted for the Coast Guard. The availability of appropriations to pay members of the Department of Defense Armed Forces terminates, or 180 days after the beginning of the lapse in Coast Guard funding. This committee has jurisdiction over the armed force outside, the only armed force outside the Department of Defense, and it is our responsibility to ensure that the members of the Coast Guard and their families are not forgotten or treated differently from their counterparts in the other services. During the recent shutdown, the Department of Defense Armed Forces received pay and were not impacted by the lapse. This bill provides parity for the Coast Guard by providing assurance that they will not be treated differently in the future. And I urge my colleagues to support the bill, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. I would note that Representative Cummings, who also chairs the, whatever we call it, committee now, oversight? Or? Yeah, oversight. We change the names around here when the majority changes. Gets confusing, and Ed wished to be here, but he was called back to his alternate duty. With that, I'd would recognize the ranking member for any statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This piece of legislation is common sense, and it does ensure fairness among the five branches of the armed services when it comes to payment during an appropriations lapse. And with that, I support the amendment in the form of a substitute and urge my colleagues to do the same, and yield back.
Does anyone else wish to be recognized? Representative Graves?
Mr. Chairman.
Sorry, I'll get you next.
Oh.
Yep. Sorry, yeah, go ahead, Bob. He yielded to you. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to concur with everything that's been said. I'm proud to be a co-sponsor of this, and as it's been said, that Coast Guard didn't get paid during the fiscal year 2019 appropriations lapse, and the other military forces did. All 367 calls for members of Coast Guard and civilian employees and retirees to be paid during the lapse of in the fiscal year, and the amendment in the nature of the substitute will ensure that members of Coast Guard get paid during any lapse, if there's any going on further. So I urge my colleagues to support the bill, and I yield back.
Thank gentlemen. Any on the Democratic side wish to be heard? Okay, if not, I recognize Representative Graves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, very quickly, we had a long discussion in this committee about the pain inflicted by a government shutdown, and we talked about how we need to be careful about making shutdowns easy, and how I personally believe that members of Congress shouldn't be paid. We should be required to report to duty every day until we get this issue, get shutdowns resolved. But one thing that distinguishes the Coast Guard from every other federal employee, with the exception of the other military services, is that Coasties are locked into a contract. They are obligated to show up to work every day. It's not like they can say, oh, well, I'm just going to quit this job and go on to another one. So I think it's an important distinguishing factor for members to keep in mind. They don't have the luxury of saying, well, if I'm not getting paid here, I'm going to get another job. They are under contract. They're obligated to show up, and they are the only military service that's treated this way. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Gibbs, Congressman Maloney, I want to thank all of you for bringing this up. I think it's an important fix. Yield back.
I thank the gentleman. That is an excellent point of clarification. In fact, we did lose some people who worked under FAA because of the lack of pay, where particularly inspectors are paid at a level less than the private sector, and some We also had trainees for the FAA who were in the middle of training, some of whom did not return after the lapse, but all those people had options. As the gentleman pointed out, that is not an option available to coasties. Any other members wish to be heard on the amendment, on the bill? Okay. If not, then are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of substitute for H.R. 367? Hearing none, we would move on to final passage. Question is now on adoption and favorably reporting H.R. 367 as amended to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, saying nay. The ayes have it. Bill as amended is approved and ordered reported favorably to the House. We now move on to H.R. 1322, requiring a report on the effects of climate change on the Coast Guard. I now call up H.R. 1322, ask unanimous consent to discharge Subcommittee on Coast Guard Maritime Transportation for further consideration of H.R. 1322, and that it be considered as read and open to amendment at any point without objection, so ordered. At that point, I would recognize myself. Predominantly located along the U.S. coastline, Coast Guard facilities and personnel are increasingly vulnerable to the effects of climate change with rising seas. However, the Coast Guard is the only, again, unique armed service yet to report on the potential impacts of climate change on its operations. Seeking parity with the other armed services, H.R. 1322 directs the Coast Guard to study its vulnerabilities to climate change, explore mitigation efforts. This study is the first step to ensuring that the Coast Guard is prepared for rising sea levels, extreme weather events caused by climate change, and I urge my colleagues on both sides to support this bill and enhance the Coast Guard's readiness in an era of changing seas. At this point, I would recognize Subcommittee Chair Maloney to explain the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your leadership on this issue as well. Climate change is a major concern across our country, across the world. Our armed forces need to be prepared to operate in a changing environment. By its nature, the Coast Guard has hundreds of properties and units located along the water's edge, which may be directly affected by climate change factors such as sea level rise, storm surge, high winds, and severe flooding. My bill directs the Commandant of the Coast Guard to provide a report to Congress on the vulnerabilities to Coast Guard installations and operational requirements resulting from climate change and related effects. This bill mirrors Section 335 of last year's NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, which required the Secretary of Defense to submit a report to Congress on vulnerabilities to military installations and combatant commander requirements resulting from climate change. Per that report, we know that most facilities that were studied are vulnerable to climate change. You don't have to be an expert to recognize the Coast Guard facilities along our shorelines will be threatened. The question is not if the Coast Guard will be affected. The question is how seriously the threat will affect the Coast Guard and what steps we can take to protect our installations. I remind my colleagues that 3 major hurricanes that passed through the U.S. in 2017 resulted in damages to Coast Guard facilities totaling close to $1 billion. The risk is real, and it makes no sense for the Coast Guard to be unprepared or to operate in ignorance. I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman for the explanation. I would now recognize the ranking member, Representative Graves, for his statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. H.R. 1322 requires a report from the Coast Guard to identify its 10 facilities that are most vulnerable to the effects of climate change and the mitigation that's going to be needed at these facilities. In February, however, the GAO reported that the Coast Guard has enormous construction and maintenance backlogs related to the service's shoreside facilities. The GAO has concluded that the Coast Guard lacked the criteria or a process to set priorities or develop an infrastructure plan based on the mission needs instead of the one-for-one replacement of existing facilities. I'd be happy to work with the majority to encourage or direct the Coast Guard to develop criteria for prioritizing shoreside construction and maintenance projects in ways that best promote the mission's effectiveness. Such criteria and their implementation should be a comprehensive and not driven by any single or one single factor. And making improvements to the Coast Guard shoreside facility construction and maintenance program, resilience in areas prone to coastal storms and flooding should be one consideration, but so should all other factors that impact the Coast Guard mission effectiveness. Unfortunately, I can't support H.R. 1322, given its limited scope and potential for skewing the Coast Guard's infrastructure plans in ways that don't promote the most effective results for the service's ability to carry out its many important missions, and hope we can address these concerns as we develop the bipartisan Coast Guard authorization bill later this year. And with that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Anyone else wish to be recognized, make a statement?
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, I'm someone somewhere. Oh, there, Don.
this is a
Recognize
good,
the gentleman from Alaska.
this is a good bill, but I was here when we first started. What the Coast Guard only had to do was buoy attendants, some navigational aids, and some rescue efforts. And we've gone every time we've authorized in this committee to do something, and we haven't pursued the funding. I don't know how much it's going to cost, but I want to make sure that we go to the committees, appropriation committees, we fund the money so they don't take away money in their major efforts. Right now, you know, we passed a drug legislation, we passed OPA, and we didn't fund them, and they've been underfunded. So we have to take and pursue that, this committee, the other committees, so we don't take away from their maiden duty. So I just wanted to bring that up.
I thank the gentleman, and I share his concern about the chronic underfunding of the Coast Guard, and would hope that we can persuade our colleagues on the Budget Committee and others to allow us to appropriate, to authorize during the coming authorization a more robust level that more fully meets their needs. Any other members wish to be recognized? Okay, hearing none, I would now say, are there any amendments to the bill? Okay. Whoop. Do we have one? Okay. Yes. Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment stems from a fairly simple premise. When it comes to our nation's security, we shouldn't outsource the work.
Would the gentleman just add, you got to follow the rigmarole here.
I do have an amendment at the desk. Sorry about that.
You're asking unanimous consent to the amendment to be considered as read, and now the clerk will announce the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 1322, offered by Mr. Perry of Pennsylvania.
Okay, now we would love to have the gentleman explain.
Thank you,
the
Mr.
amendment.
Chairman. I appreciate your guidance.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment stems from a fairly simple premise. When it comes to our nation's security, we shouldn't outsource the work to organizations that do not prioritize the interests of the American people. The UN IPCC clearly does not share our priorities and oftentimes is openly hostile to the United States. Using their products to inform our security policies puts our nation at a strategic disadvantage. This reality is bolstered by the influence of our adversaries, China and Russia, and the influence that they have in the IPCC process. The IPCC includes both Chinese and Russian climate models, and in their modeling suite, allowing them to influence the report's projected outcomes. Even worse, the IPCC approval process for the summary for policymakers allows any member nation to object to a conclusion and demand changes. The IPCC then amends the underlying report to ensure consistency with the summary. Since the summary is typically released before the report itself, the full extent of these changes is unknowable. It is wholly inappropriate to use information subject to this much enemy influence for the purpose of determining security policy. The strategic disadvantage is further enhanced by the fact that neither the Chinese nor Russians appear to be taking the IPCC's claims of catastrophic global warming very seriously. This is made clear by the emissions reductions plan submitted during the Paris Agreement. China's carbon emissions reduction plan does not go into effect until 2030. As a matter of fact, their projected business-as-usual emission peak, and even then, the reductions are less than business-as-usual scenario. Russia's plan actually reported increases in its emissions. Given the overtly hostile actions by both Russia and China in recent years, it is suicidal as a nation to base our security policy decisions on information subject to the influence of adversaries that even they don't find credible enough to rely on for their own purposes. Aside from the foreign influence, the performance of the IPCC's modeling suite has rendered the suite and all information based on its result not credible for policy analysis. Matter of fact, Dr. John Christie, the head of climate research at the University of Alabama at Huntsville, conducted research on the efficacy of the suite's predictions and found, on average, they overpredicted measured temperatures by more than a factor of 3. Given the widespread usage of the IPCC modeling projections, including use as the scientific base for the 4th National Climate Assessment, this finding is extremely alarming. Clearly, the projections produced by these models are not representative of reality. Security policies must be informed by credible data from sources free from the various purposes. For the sake of national security, we can and must do better than the IPCC products. The lives of the American people depend on it, and I yield.
I thank the gentleman. I recognize myself in opposition to the amendment. I'll say that I agree with some of the shortcomings of the, our competitor nations around the world and potentially the United States under this administration in meeting our obligations to reduce carbon pollution and accelerate, climate change. We could, and the Science Committee has more jurisdiction than us to debate the facts regarding climate change, but I'll say that China and Russia would ignore this totally at their own peril and to our advantage because they may find some of their strategic bases to be flooded and their naval forces unable to deploy or their air force unable to deploy or their military. And if we, as we are doing with the Marines, the Air Force, and the Navy and the Army, they have all, come to conclusions regarding the need to construct and reconstruct our facilities to deal with climate change. The NDAA included a provision that required DOD to construct a critical infrastructure 3 feet above base flood elevation and non-critical infrastructure at 2 feet above base flood elevation. Yet at this point, the Coast Guard has no directives nor plan to deal with what all other military forces are dealing with. Just last week, Nebraska flooding had a significant impact on runway operations at Offutt Air Force Base, home of our the SAC, Strategic Air Command, to see the wisdom of providing for these climatic events in order that we can better defend the United States of America. So I would oppose the gentleman's amendment and recognize other members who wish to speak.
Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I thank you for your comments, and I would concur. The gentleman's amendment is a solution in search of a problem. The bill requires a study. There's nothing in the bill that requires it in any way to be bound or to follow IPCC conclusions or models. It's a bit of a non sequitur, although I do share the gentleman's concern for reality, so I just wanted to inject some into this conversation. I urge my colleagues to oppose it.
Any others wishing to be recognized? Yes, the gentleman from New Jersey.
I fully agree with.
Tom, I don't think your mic's on. Oh, okay. Well, yeah, okay. Better. A little closer.
I fully second your remarks, Mr. Chairman, and would just want to say for the record that the IPCC draws its recommendations from the work of thousands of climate scientists around the world, most of whom work in the United States or in countries that are allied with the United States. And the notion that these scientists are somehow under enemy influence is something that I find deeply offensive. I would urge my colleague to either withdraw that allegation or to back it up with hard facts. Thank you.
Other members?
Mr. Chairman?
Yes. Yes. The gentleman is recognized.
Representative Davids from Kansas 3rd. I just wanted to reiterate that the Coast Guard, and specifically the Commandant of the Coast Guard, I believe, has the wherewithal and the discernment to decide whether or not reports are accurate and should be taken into account when deciding what threats exist or don't exist to various facilities and bases In fact, I might be mistaken, but I believe the commandant has a civil engineering degree and probably has a decent amount of experience in deciding whether or not the IPCC or any other study should be used when deciding what threats to our national security exist. And for that reason, I wouldn't support this amendment.
I thank the gentlelady. Other comments on the amendment? Hearing none. Okay, then are there amendments to the amendment? Hearing none, then we'll move forward. The question is on the amendment. Those are in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed by saying nay. Nay. In the judgment of the chair, the nays have it.
Mr. Chairman, I request a recorded vote.
All right. The recorded vote was requested. Is there a, I don't know what a sufficient second means, but is there a sufficient second, which I don't think is too many? Okay. Is that sufficient?
Yeah,
I'm talking about
Mr. Chairman, point of order. I don't know that we need seconds for recorded votes.
I don't know.
In fact, I can tell you from a rules
Well,
standpoint, we don't
I
need seconds for
Yeah,
recorded votes.
I don't think so either, but whatever. Anything we can do to obstruct the progress here. The recorded vote is called. A sufficient number of members have requested a recorded vote. A recorded vote is ordered. I think we have sufficient members here to move forward with a recorded vote. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. DeFazio.
No.
Mr. DeFazio votes no. Ms. Norton.
No.
Ms. Norton votes no. Ms. Johnson of Texas.
No.
Ms. Johnson of Texas votes no. Mr. Cummings. Mr. Larson of Washington. No. Mr. Larson of Washington votes no. Mrs. Napolitano. Mrs. Napolitano votes no. Mr. Lipinski. Mr. Cohen. Mr. Cohen votes no. Mr. Sires. Mr. Sires votes no. Mr. Garamendi. Mr. Johnson of Georgia. Mr. Carson of Indiana. Mr. Carson of Indiana votes no. Ms. Titus. No. Ms. Titus votes no. Mr. Sean Patrick Maloney of New York. No. Mr. Sean Patrick Maloney of New York votes no. Mr. Huffman. Ms. Brownlee of California. No. Ms. Brownlee of California votes no. Ms. Wilson of Florida. No. Ms. Wilson of Florida votes no. Mr. Payne. Mr. Lowenthal. No. Mr. Lowenthal votes no. Mr. DeSaulnier. No. Mr. DeSaulnier votes no. Ms. Plaskett. Mr. Lynch. Mr. Carbajal. No. Mr. Carbajal votes no. Mr. Brown of Maryland. No. Mr. Brown of Maryland votes no. Mr. Espelot. No. Mr. Espelot votes no. Mr. Malinowski. No. Mr. Malinowski votes no. Mr. Stanton.
No.
Mr. Stanton votes no. Ms. Marcuso-Powell.
No.
Ms. Marcuso-Powell votes no. Mrs. Fletcher. Mr. Allred. No. Mr. Allred votes no. Ms. Davids of Kansas.
No.
Ms. Davids of Kansas votes no. Ms. Finkenauer.
No.
Ms. Finkenauer votes no. Mr. Garcia of Illinois. No. Mr. Garcia of Illinois votes no. Mr. Delgado. No. Mr. Delgado votes no. Mr. Pappas. No. Mr. Pappas votes no. Mrs. Craig. No. Mrs. Craig votes no. Mr. Rauda. No. Mr. Rauda votes no. Mr. Graves of Missouri.
Aye.
Mr. Graves of Missouri votes aye. Mr. Young. Aye. Mr. Young votes aye. Mr. Crawford. Aye. Mr. Crawford votes aye. Mr. Gibbs. Aye. Mr. Gibbs votes aye. Mr. Webster of Florida. Yay. Mr. Webster of Florida votes aye. Mr. Massey. Aye. Mr. Massey votes aye. Mr. Meadows. Aye. Mr. Meadows votes aye. Mr. Perry. Aye. Mr. Perry votes aye. Mr. Davids of Illinois. Mr. Woodall. Mr. Katko. No. Mr. Katko votes no. Mr. Babin. Yes. Mr. Babin votes aye. Mr. Graves of Louisiana. No. Mr. Graves of Louisiana votes no. Mr. Rouser. Aye. Mr. Rouser votes aye. Mr. Bost. Aye. Mr. Vost votes aye. Mr. Weber of Texas.
Aye.
Mr. Weber of Texas votes aye. Mr. LaMalfa. Aye. Mr. LaMalfa votes aye. Mr. Westerman. Aye. Mr. Westerman votes aye. Mr. Smucker. Aye. Mr. Smucker votes aye. Mr. Mitchell. Aye. Mr. Mitchell votes aye. Mr. Mast. No. Mr. Mast votes no. Mr. Gallagher. No. Mr. Gallagher votes no. Mr. Palmer. Aye. Mr. Palmer votes aye. Mr. Fitzpatrick. Ms. Gonzalez Colon of Puerto Rico. Mr. Balderson. Mr. Balderson votes aye. Mr. Spano. Aye. Mr. Spano votes aye. Mr. Stopper. Mr. Stopper votes aye. Mrs. Miller. Mrs. Miller votes aye. Mr. Pence. Mr. Pence votes aye. Mr. Cummings. Mr. Lipinski.
No.
Mr. Lipinski votes no. Mr. Garamendi. Mr. Johnson of Georgia. Mr. Huffman. Mr. Payne. Ms. Plaskett. Mr. Lynch. Mrs. Fletcher. Mr. Davis of Illinois. Mr. Woodall. Mr. Fitzpatrick. Ms. Gonzalez Colon of Puerto Rico.
Are there any members who are not recorded who wish to be recorded? Does the clerk have the tally? Yes. While the clerk is tallying, I will say to the committee and to the clerk that it's the tradition of this committee to alternate sides when we go through a vote. I know that this is your first roll call, but in the future, we will go in order of seniority on each side, and that's the way the committee has always done it. So with that, do you have the results?
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 22 yeas and 33 noes.
Okay. The amendment is not adopted. We would then, are there further amendments to the bill? If not, the question is now on the adoption and favorably reporting of H.R. 1322 to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed by saying nay. Okay, the ayes have it. The bill is approved and ordered reported favorably to the House. Now, well, hopefully you could hear me. You don't want me to repeat myself. Anyway, we're doing 1306. I would ask the subcommittee chair to explain the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also want to thank the ranking member, Mr. Meadows, for leading the effort on this bill along with Congressman Peters from California. When disasters strike, it's vital that the flow of assistance begins as soon as possible. Accordingly, we should do what we can to speed up the process by which disaster assessments occur, thereby helping reach decisions about relief more efficiently and expeditiously. Currently, multiple federal agencies conduct preliminary damage assessments after disasters occur, leading to a duplication of efforts. This bill would establish a working group led by the Federal Emergency Management Administration, FEMA, to identify opportunities to restructure federal disaster assessments with a goal of eliminating overlap by agencies. This will not only save taxpayer dollars, but will better assist victims who have often lost everything in that disaster. For that reason, I support H.R. 1306, encourage you all to do so, and yield back.
I thank the gentlelady for that explanation. I would now recognize the ranking member for any statement on this bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank not only you, Mr. Chairman, but the chairman of the subcommittee for her willingness to work in a bipartisan fashion to move this legislation. And also to compliment you, Mr. Chairman, and the ranking member of this full committee. This is a very substantial markup with real bills that will make a real impact. And so I want to just compliment you on your leadership and thank you so much for allowing this bipartisan piece of legislation to come before the body. I want to thank Representative Scott Peters of California for his work. And as the chairman said, this is just a common sense piece of legislation, and I can tell you what it truly addresses for us is there is an alphabet soup list of agencies that are always requiring information. And as Congressman Rouser knows all too well in North Carolina, what happens is over and over and over again, we get requests for information. and you supply the information for one agency only to find out that there's another agency and yet another agency and another agency that request similar information and suggest that the request has not been completed. So this actually puts it under the FEMA's direction, hopefully consolidates it. It is a good government common sense bill. I would ask my colleagues to support it, and with that, in the interest of time, I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. I now recognize Ranking Member Graves for his statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I want to say how happy I am that today this committee is considering several bills that are going to improve disaster recovery efforts in the United States. Every single one of our districts at one time or another has been hit by one disaster or another. In my district right now, and many districts throughout the Midwest, we're being hit by some very severe flooding. So I appreciate what this committee can do to continue to improve our federal disaster programs, and I have no doubt that everyone in the room feels the same. And specifically on this bill, I do want to thank Subcommittee Ranking Member Meadows for his leadership on this piece of legislation. The bottom line is that when we reduce duplication and streamlining the damage assessment process, that's going to go a long way to speed up these recovery efforts. And with that, I'd urge support of this legislation. Yield back the balance.
Any other members wish to be recognized?
Chairman,
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, I'm pleased that we're
Gentlelady's
considering these bills that streamline our approach to disaster relief. But I really want to go on record saying that I think I have the feeling that with these notwithstanding these important bills, particularly the ways in which they allow us to get to a disaster, and instead of putting bureaucracy in the way, that I very much have the feeling of fiddling while Rome is burning. Climate change is upon us, and some of you are from parts of the country where you cannot deny that to be the case. And yet there has been no federal study on the effects of climate change on our country. We are way behind the ball on even understanding climate change, and by dealing with these bills, important as they are, we are dealing with minute effects that will have, in some parts of the country, little effect if they have the kind of disasters we're seeing confront them throughout the country. FEMA and nobody else will be able to deal with those unless the country comes to grips with climate change and adopts a policy that begins to grapple with it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, gentlelady. Any other members wish to be recognized? Yes, gentleman from Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank the Ranking Member Meadows and Congressman Peter for introducing this legislation. We are a co-sponsor. He has absolutely hit the nail on the head, been going through numerous disasters. Disaster victims are often asked to apply and provide the same information 5 and 6 times to different agencies. No data sharing. The damage assessment process, the same thing. Local government, state government, and multiple federal agencies are tripping over each other, coming up with inconsistent information that's supposed to guide us on the investment of billions of dollars in the response to disasters. I do want to highlight as we move forward, we did enact H.R. 1679, PL 11587 last Congress, which does get into the online database component of this we ought to talk about. And also, Ranking Member Meadows, just looking forward to working with you. A few things as we move forward, looking at how we do a better job with temporary housing and long-term recovery. We're paying triple in some cases, and I think it's a right place for efficiency there. Also, alternative arrangements, including NEPA. As you and I have discussed, we've seen where they're doing individual NEPA assessments on every single home. Whenever you may have a neighborhood that has cookie-cutter homes without lead, asbestos, and other things, it is a waste of money and ultimately taking away from disaster victims. Lastly, the amount of compliance cost. We had a contract in Louisiana, I believe they issued for $250 million to a contractor to administer this program just to comply with the federal regulations. It's outrageous. It is taking money away from flood victims and delaying the process. So thanks again for doing this. It's a step in the right direction.
Would the gentleman yield?
Please.
I want to thank the gentleman for his leadership in so many areas. I mean, representing the state of Louisiana, it would be very easy to have this as your priority. But let me just tell you, you have dug in, you have highlighted problems that we have and worked in a bipartisan way. I want to thank the gentleman for his leadership, and I look forward to working with him and the ranking member of our committee, but also the two chairmen, and I thank them, and I yield back to the gentleman from Louisiana.
I thank the
Yield back.
two gentlemen. I would, just out of order, recognize the gentleman from North Carolina. If you might see there's someone very prominent standing in the door from North Carolina.
Actually, that's my guest.
Okay,
so
very
I
good.
appreciate it. So I would like to recognize Miss North Carolina, who is here today.
All right.
We thank you for your leadership.
Excellent, thank you. I would have recognized had I known who invited her. In any case, are there any amendments to 1306?
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, what?
over here.
Where?
Mr. Chairman.
I'm going to be happy when we get back in our room. Yeah, the gentleman from North Carolina. I've done from California. God,
California.
I got stuck on North. Sorry, I got
but a
stuck
tough act to follow, Miss North Carolina. But nevertheless, I just wanted to call to the attention of the committee. The National Low Income Housing Coalition rightly noted to the members of this committee that the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development is not included in the working group under H.R. 1306 as currently drafted. This is despite the Department of Housing and Urban Development being covered by the study to streamline and consolidate information collection and preliminary damage assessments elsewhere in the bill. This is a legitimate concern that should be rectified before the bill is considered by the full House, as HUD properties are often damaged during these disasters, and would request that it be taken under consideration.
Well, I thank the gentleman for his concern and his remarks, and as we move toward the floor, there is another committee working on this legislation. There's some jurisdictional issues, and be happy to attempt to accommodate his concerns if we go to the floor. So
Thank you.
I thank the gentleman. Any other members wish to be recognized at this point? If not, there are no amendments. Then the question is now on the adoption favorably reporting H.R. 1306. House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed by saying nay. Nay. It's unanimous. Bill as amended is approved and ordered reported to the House. We now move on to H.R. 1307, Post-Disaster Assistance Online Accountability Act. I call up H.R. 1307, asking unanimous consent to discharge Subcommittee on Economic Development, Public Buildings, Emergency Management from further consideration of H.R. 1307 and be considered as read and open to amendment at any point without objection, so ordered. I would now recognize the Subcommittee Chair for a explanation of legislation. Ms. Titus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess to keep up with my ranking member, I'm going to have to bring a showgirl from Vegas since you got that. I don't know.
We will not comment.
Just make sure they're an attorney as well.
Actually, I'd like to thank again the ranking member, Mr. Meadows, for bringing this bill forward along with Congressman Peters of California. It's another bill that's aimed at improving recovery efforts following a disaster. Transparency in federal spending is an important goal for all of us across all federal agencies, but it's becoming increasingly important when it comes to disaster response in the wake of extreme weather caused by global climate change that's resulted in more destruction and increased frequency. This bill creates an online repository to which federal agencies submit information regarding disaster assistance on a quarterly basis, including a detailed list of an agency's projects or activities and the exact amount of assistance expended by that agency. This will better track federal disaster assistance, ensure congressional oversight of tax dollars, and offer increased transparency to the public. It's a good bill. I urge support of it. I urge you to vote for it, and I yield back.
At this point, I would recognize, do you wish to go? Okay, the ranking member of the subcommittee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, I thank the chairman of the subcommittee for her willingness to consider this, and yours as well. I would just like to put it in context. This particular bill allows for us to actually have greater transparency, where you don't have to search through reams of documents to find little codes to figure out what we've spent money on. And the genesis actually had an unusual combination. Back then, it was Senator Tom Coburn and Senator Barack Obama that actually put forth a venue where we could understand what is being spent. This just adds another component there where we can have transparency. It's, again, a good government accountability measure that Scott Peters and Scott Peters of California and I have been able to work together. We would urge all of our colleagues to support that, and with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman for his remarks. Any other members wish to be recognized? Hearing none, move forward then. If there are none, any amendments? No amendments? Okay. If there are none, question is now on adoption favorably reporting H.R. 1307 to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed by saying nay. Bill is approved, ordered, reported favorably to the House. H.R. 1311, amending the Robert T. Stafford Disaster Relief and Emergency Assistance Act to ensure that unmet needs after a major disaster are met. I call up H.R. 1311, asking unanimous consent to discharge Subcommittee on Economic Development, Public Buildings, Emergency Management from further consideration of H.R. 1311, and that it be considered as read and adopted and open to amendment at any point without objection. So ordered. I would now recognize Subcommittee Chair for an explanation of legislation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is the third bill in a package to improve the disaster relief process. I thank Congressman Graves of Louisiana for bringing this. It adds a new section to the Stafford Act to speed up the disbursement of federal disaster funds, which will allow more flexibility for states to address unmet needs, such as long-term housing solutions and business recovery activities. In recent years, Congress has tried to address these needs via other federal programs located throughout the bureaucracy of the government. But we've seen significant delays time and again in distributing these dollars because of these duplicative requirements. It's often that the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. With major disasters becoming more severe and frequent because of global climate change, legislation like this will help to reduce the red tape that delays assistance to our communities when they need it most. I urge passage of this bill, and I yield back.
Recognize the gentleman, the subcommittee ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I too want to echo the chairman's acknowledgement of the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Graves, for his leadership on this critical piece of legislation as we look to streamline the process on disasters. Oftentimes, we will take votes to allocate large amounts of the taxpayer dollars to address those issues. And yet those same dollars sit, sadly, on the sidelines often, not to be deployed because of inefficiencies. The gentleman has been very, very thoughtful in working to try to consolidate some of those. Certainly this is one that makes sure that we're more accountable and gives communities that are impacted by these disasters a much more streamlined process for such assistance. I can tell you we were just on a call the other day with the Secretary of HUD with issues that affects not only Congressman Graves' district in Louisiana, but Congressman Weber's district in Texas, Congressman Rouser's district in North Carolina, and I know we've all seen it. Sheila Jackson Lee, a number of others from areas that have been impacted by disasters, and yet we have this bottleneck. This legislation goes and is a good step forward on trying to address that. I want to thank the gentleman. I would urge all my colleagues to support it, and with that, I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. Any other members wish to be recognized? Yes, Mr. Graves from Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank Congresswoman Titus, Congressman Meadows, the chair and ranking of the subcommittee, for working with us on this, and I want to give a a huge kudos to Congresswoman Plaskett, who we've been working with very closely on this. Obviously, with the extraordinary disasters we've had over the last several years, whether it was the 1,000-year flood in South Louisiana, where we represent, or Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, Maria, the California wildfires, more recently the Hurricanes Michael and Florence, all sorts of challenges. And of course, right now, Mr. Chairman, what's going on in the Midwest with the river system. You have two kinds of congressional districts, those that have been hit by disasters and those that will. As you look at all of these after-action reports, GAO, Inspector General, and others, you see constant themes. We've got an alphabet soup of agencies that are out there trying to get involved in disasters. USDA, Department of Commerce, FEMA, SBA, HUD, and many others. And Mr. Chairman, they're tripping over each other. We did an incredible bipartisan job last year by enacting the Disaster Recovery and Reform Act, the most significant changes to disaster policy, to the Stafford Act, since that act was initially written. And it is going to benefit disaster victims, and it is going to save taxpayer monies. It's going to be more efficient. This bill takes it a step further. What happens after disasters is that you may or may not get long-term recovery dollars through HUD. You don't even know. So here you have these temporary dollars for temporary housing, hotels, mobile homes, whatever they are, where you have these disaster victims, these states, communities have no idea if they're going to get long-term recovery dollars or not. Then the amount of recovery dollars is subject to a Ouija board. And so this bill provides certainty that money is available. Maybe it comes 2 years later, 3 years later, maybe 2 weeks later. This bill provides certainty. It provides metrics for how much money these areas can get. And importantly, as the ranking member just noted, Mr. Chairman, we appropriated tens of billions of dollars for disaster victims and improving the resiliency of our communities over a year ago. HUD hadn't even written the Federal Register notice yet. Hadn't even put a notice in the Federal Register on the dollars. Tens of billions of dollars in recovery and resilience funds are sitting in the bank, and they haven't even published a Federal Register notice in over a year. I could have done that in 3 days, because it's not reinventing the wheel. There's already precedent for this. This paper exists, and it is ridiculous what we're doing to people. This provides certainty. It's going to save taxpayers money. It's going to help to recover faster, and it's going to help to clean up this alphabet soup of agencies that are involved in disasters and having a seamless transition between temporary and long-term recovery. Again, I want to thank the Ranking Member Meadows, Chair Titus, and I especially want to thank Congresswoman Plaskett, who's going through an awful recovery with Irma and Maria in the Virgin Islands, for the hard work and working with us on this to perfect the legislation, and I yield adoption. Yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. Anyone else wish to be recognized? Hearing none. Any amendments to H.R. 1311? Hearing none. If there are none, the question is now on adoption, favorably reporting H.R. 1311 to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, nay. The ayes have it. The bill is approved and ordered reported favorably to the House. The last piece of business for the committee today is the H.R. 1331. I now call up H.R. 1331, asking unanimous consent to discharge Subcommittee on Water Resources and Environment from further consideration of H.R. 1331 and be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. Without objection, so ordered. Recognize myself for brief remarks. I want to, in particular, congratulate Representative Craig for her first piece of legislation moving out of this committee. And look forward to many more, and obviously Representative Mast on this bipartisan legislation. With that, I would recognize the subcommittee chair, Napolitano. Oops. Oh, there she is. Okay. I thought you were up here on the dais. Okay. For an explanation of the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I strongly support H.R. 1331. As you noted, a bipartisan bill to reauthorize appropriations for the U.S. Environment Protection Agency, EPA, non-point solution source management grants program. And I also want to thank the Ranking Member Westerman for working with us and Representatives Craig and Mast for introducing the bill. The non-point solution sources of water pollution come from many different and diffuse sources, including runoff from farms, managed forests, and urban areas. This runoff can carry pollutants such as fertilizers and sediments from fields, toxins from abandoned mines, and oils and heavy metals from roads into lakes, rivers, and other bodies of water. Today, according to the data provided by the state of California, my state, approximately 89% of my state's assessed rivers and streams do not meet the state water quality standards. Of that number, somewhere between 30 to 60% are impaired because non-point sources of pollution in the state, both urban and rural sources. The number is staggering and has remained relatively constant over the past decade, and I am sure duplicated in states across the country. The Clean Water Act, enacted in 1972 to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's water. In 1987, the Clean Water Act was amended to add Section 319 to create a non-regulatory program through which EPA administers annual grants to help states develop and implement their own programs for managing non-point solution waters of water pollution. Under EPA's 319 program, states retain the primary role for addressing non-point source water pollution, which they do, largely through voluntary means and financial incentives. However, according to GAO, the extent of available incentives has declined in recent years as grants to the states under Section 319 program have declined by more than 30% from a high of about $240 million annually in fiscal year 2004. The Section 319 program was initially authorized at $70 million in 1998, and its authorization level steadily increased to $130 million in fiscal year 1991, the last year of authorization for the program. Since that time, the program has been authorized through annual appropriations for EPA. In fiscal year 2019, Section 319 received a federal appropriation of $170.9 million, but the President's fiscal year 2020 budget request proposes zero, I repeat, zero funding for the program. H.R. 1331 would authorize $200 million annually for Section 319 program through 2024. This would be a modest increase of current appropriated level for the popular program, but less than the historical peak for this bill in the year 2000 of $240 million. I support Section 319 program, ask my colleagues to join me in supporting. Thank the gentlewoman from Minnesota, Ms. Craig, gentleman from Florida, Mr. Mast, for introducing the bipartisan bill, and I yield back.
Are there other members who wish to be recognized? Yes, a gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Chairman. And I thank the committee for their work on this piece of legislation, the Local Water Protection Act. It is important. Every one of us, doesn't matter what state we represent, doesn't matter what cities or towns we have in our district. We all have waterways that are important to us, lakes, streams, tributaries. They haven't always been taken care of on a number of different levels, whether it's at the state or local level, whether it's from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers or some branch of the military that may have a military base nearby, whether it's agriculture or industry or something else. These waterways, they're important to our communities, they're important to industry, they're important to our way of life, to fresh drinking water supply, to irrigation, and to 100 different fronts. And this is a great approach that does not lend itself to what can sometimes happen in Washington, which is DC one-size-fits-all approach. This allows for communities to go out there and try and repair those failures in their local waterways through this assistance. In some areas, it can lead to dredging out legacy pollutants. It can lead to converting septic tanks into sewer systems, implementing really quality best management practices, restoring impaired waterways on a number of different fronts, taking waterways that have perhaps been channelized or altered by the Corps of Engineers, helping to fix those waterways, things that have been done decades before any of us have sat on these dioceses. It's important legislation. It helps all of our local communities, and I urge everybody's support on this piece of legislation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do yield back.
I thank the gentleman. And yes, I recognize the gentlelady.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. And I just want to say thank you so much to my Republican colleague, Mr. Mast of Florida. As a Minnesotan, and we had record snowfall here in February, as that starts to melt, we're all reminded that nature has a way of increasing pollutants in our waterways and in our water. So I just want to say to the committee, I appreciate your consideration of this important piece of legislation, and that will allow our local communities and states to make those conservation improvements. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady for her work on this and for her statement. Others wishing to be recognized? Yes, the ranking subcommittee member.
Thank you, Chairman DeFazio and Ranking Member Graves, and also to Subcommittee Chair Napolitano. I also support this bill, and I want to thank the bill sponsors, Ms. Craig from Minnesota, who I will add grew up in my home state of Arkansas, and Mr. Mass from Florida. As it's already been described, H.R. 1331 reauthorizes the Section 319 non-point source pollution control program that's under the Clean Water Act. Reauthorizing this program reinforces the federal leadership that's being provided to help our state and local partners in their non-source control efforts. As has already been mentioned, this program has benefited water bodies all across the country, and including in my district. Just a brief example, when increasing sedimentation significantly impaired Days Creek, an important tributary to the Sulphur River, the Arkansas Natural Resources Commission used a $12,000 Section 319 grant to help address erosion from agricultural sources, which improved water quality, and then we were able to remove Days Creek from Arkansas's list of impaired waters, and that happened back in 2008. Again, this is a good bill. I support it, and I yield back.
I thank the ranking member. Other statements?
Mr. Chair,
Yes. Where are we?
to your left down here.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to congratulate my fellow congressional member from the state of Minnesota, Representative Craig, for your leadership on this and passing this first piece of legislation through T&I. So congratulations. I'm looking forward to voting yes on this.
Excellent. Other statements? Hearing none. Any amendments? No amendments. If there are none, questions now on adoption favorably reporting H.R. 1331 to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, nay. Nay. The bill is approved, reported favorably to the House. I ask unanimous consent that each bill reported today will be reported as a single amendment, the nature of a substitute, incorporating any amendments adopted without objection so ordered. I ask unanimous consent staff be authorized to make all necessary technical, clarifying, conforming changes to each of the bills ordered reported today to reflect the actions of the committee without objection so ordered. Pursuant to House Rule 22, Clause 1, I ask unanimous consent that the chair or his designee be authorized to offer such motions as may be necessary in the House to go to conference with the Senate on the legislation adopted today or any similar measure without objection so ordered. I ask unanimous consent that pursuant to Rule 11, Clause 2, 1, or L, members have at least 2 calendar days in which to file a supplemental minority, additional, or dissenting views of the legislation adopted today without objection so ordered. And asking unanimous consent, Chairman, after consultation with the ranking member, has authority to strike or revise any provision of the bills ordered reported today that would cause sequential referral to another committee or that would cause the bills or concurrent resolutions to be subject to Budget Act or Rule 21 PAYGO. Point of order. Without objection so ordered. Pursuant to Rule 5 of the Rules Committee on Transportation Infrastructure, the chair notes the presence of a quorum for actions taken on all committee business today. With that, the Committee on Transportation Infrastructure has completed its business for the day. Congratulations, everybody. Thank you very much. Appreciate your presence. The committee is adjourned. Thanks. Yep. That was pretty good. Hour. Yeah. 8 bills.